everyone. In today's video, I'm going to check out how I went at the International Team Tournament at Northampton, England. Our 5-person team set up. Each team would nominate a list as a defender and 2 lists as attackers. They would then both choose an attacker whom they wanted the defender to play against, and this was repeated until each player had an opponent. What this meant is that often you could have favourable matchups organised. On the flip side, you'd be taking one for the team, taking on an opponent whom none of you had a chance of beating, allowing your teammates to take on other favourable opponents. The tournament had 60-something teams with relatively competitive meta turnout, so plenty of Custodes, Mechanicus and Drukhari. Across the 300 players, there were about 6 Astra Militarum players, and I was lucky enough to chat to most of them. More interestingly, I'll include 2 of their games in this video, examining their army lists, secondary objectives and whether they went first. So quickly, the army list I took is the one I've spoken about before several times. A Catechin Brigade with a company commander, Demolisher Triple Flamer Tank Commander, Battle Cannon Tank Commander, 4 infantry squads, 2 Scion squads, 2 3-man Volgrim squads, a Mortar Team squad, 2 full payload Manticores, a Demolisher Lehman Rush Triple Flamer, 2 Scout Sentinels, an Armoured Sentinel, 2 Double Flamer Chimeras and an Inquisitor. My list is pretty well rounded, having a bit of everything, being able to participate in all phases of the game. Our next Astra Militarum commander is Callum, who is also a supporter of the channel. He takes Acadian Spearhead with Punisher Gatling Cannon Tank Commander, Demolisher Tank Commander, 3 infantry squads, a Basilisk, full payload Manticore, Wyvern and a Demolisher Lehman Russell Triple Flamer. He then has Acadian Patrol with Knight Commander Pask with Demolisher Cannon, a Gatekeeper equipped Tank Commander, 22 Conscripts, 2 Scion squads and a single Scout Sentinel. You can see Callum goes for maximum firepower, running a mixture of Strength 10 high volume shots and Strength 4 or 5 high volume shots. Having spoken a lot to Callum, I know he takes full advantage of the new Acadian stratagems, pulling the stratagem Never Give Up, Never Surrender, turning one of his Lehman Russes from a spearhead attachment into an objective secured block of armour. And our final Astra Militarum commander is Charlie. He plays a spear detachment, taking gunnery experts and spotter details. He had 2 tank commanders with demolishers and triple heavy bolters, 2 demolisher Lehman Russes and 2 full payload Manticores. He then has a battalion with a demolisher tank commander, Tempestus Prime, 5 Scion squads and 2 Plasma Eclipse Scion command squads. He also has 3 Scout Sentinels and the Inquisitor Courtiers. You can clearly see Charlie has gone from maximum devastation, but also maximum maneuverability from 6 Scion units. We all experienced different levels of success, and the first mission played was Abandoned Sanctuaries. Here I came up against Thousand Suns, Callum against Imperial Fist and Charlie against Death Guard. In this top-down deployment, none of us got first turn, and I went with the secondaries of Engage All Fronts, Retrieve Knuckleman Data, and No Prisoners, given my opponent had 5 squads of 10 2-wound Rubric Marines. I never played Thousand Suns before, and my opponent used a spell to pick up a squad of Rubrics and plonk them 9 inches away from my artillery castle on my right flank. From there, I'm pretty sure he moved them a further 6 inches via a spell, and then had a leisurely 3-inch charge. Talking to some other players, this isn't possible, and my opponent may have simply just rolled a 9-inch charge, but either way, he managed to clog up my Scout Sentinel, Armoured Sentinel, Volgrims and 1 Manticore. Looking back, I should have better fallen back my units and flattened them with Vengeance Vicaria on my untagged Manticore. Given he got first turn, he also had early units on the central objectives, and I struggled to clear them off. I ended up getting thrashed 39 to 93, scoring only 8 on primaries to my opponent's 45. Callum also struggled against Imperial Fist, taking Retrieve Knuckleman Data for the Emperor and behind enemy lines. From what Callum said, he lost 1 Lehman Russ in turn 1, and by turn 2 he'd lost a further 3. He also got thrashed going down 37 to 98, with Moni scoring 7 on secondaries to opponent's 43. Poop. Charlie, however, had a lot more success, defeating his Death Guard opponent 55 to 83, with his secondary selection winning him the game. He took behind enemy lines, deployed teleport homers and fought the Emperor. I wasn't able to talk to him about his game, but these looked like the perfect secondaries for his Scion heavy list. So at this point, it was one victory for the Guard across the 3 players. So from there we went on to data scry salvage. This deployment style is better for guard, with the increased distance between deployment zones and the deeper deployment zone, meaning we can create more space to our opponent. Here I played Necrons, Callum played Tyranids and Charlie against Custodes. I went second again, whilst both Callum and Charlie went first. Here I chose the secondaries of Psychic Interrogation, Retrieve Knuckleman Data and Engage All Fronts. In this game, having the mortars came in really handy, destroying his fast-moving scarabs, whilst the manticores decimated his main melee units of Scorpec destroyers. I used the chimeras as roadblocks, pulling the stratagem Crush them on a chimera to charge a 15-man squad of Necron warriors. In this game, I actually felt like I was effectively trading units with my opponent. This is a principle I've heard about before, with the idea being that you give your opponent low-cost units for the high-cost units and basically play a game of attrition. I felt I played quite well in this game and ended up winning 77-62. Callum also had success against the Tyranids. He took Retrieve Knuckleman Data, no prisoners and to the last. Having not seen his opponent's list, I can imagine his Wyvern would have had an absolute field day mixing Hormigons and Termagants. Likewise, his Punisher Gatling Cannon would have had a great time as well, and Callum won 77-43. Charlie playing the Custodes had a tougher time. He took the secondaries of behind enemy lines, deployed teleport homers and for the Emperor. For the Emperor would have been risky given their low unit count, but he probably had no other viable options. Custodes are a tough opponent, as they rarely give away secondaries like Bring It Down or No Prisoners. Charlie lost 63-92, which is very similar to how I scored against them in a game I played several weeks ago. So at this point we had 4 victories of 6 games. Go us. Game 3 was Conversion, with, in my opinion, one of the worst maps for Astra Militarum. It's only got 18 inches between deployment zones, so turn 1 charges are a real possibility. Here I played Orcs, Callum Death Guard and Charlie against Raven Guard. Yet again I went second, whilst the other 2 blokes went first, lucky devils. Here I came up against 2 Orc Jets, a Kill Rig, a Squig Buggy, Squig Hog Boys, topped up with a Gargantuan Skugoff. This monstrosity of a model has 36 wounds, inflicts D6 mortal wounds on the charge, and carries 15 boys. I was lucky that this mission had a decent amount of terrain in our deployment zones, meaning my opponent had to spend a fair bit of time manoeuvring his units into place. I took the secondaries of Engage All Fronts, deployed teleport homers and for the Emperor. My opponent rushed his jets towards my armour, and luckily had a disappointing shooting phase. I initially focused my manticores on his Squig Hog Boys, as I knew his larger models would be slow getting into position. Again, I used low-cost units to deal with the Kill Rig and Squigoff, putting Sentinels, Chimeras and Infantry squads in the way of them. It ended up being a really close game, with me losing only 70-74. And if I'd gone first, I probably could have won the game, possibly killing more units and holding more objectives earlier on. Callum took Retrieve Knuckleman Data, Bring It Down and Stranglehold against the Death Guard, and he did very well, beating them 80-48, even managing to get a full 15 points on Stranglehold. I didn't see this game, but assumed getting first turn meant he was able to secure more objectives against a slow-moving Death Guard. I assume also, given Callum held more objectives in turn 5, that he had nearly almost tabled his opponent. Charlie pulled a razor-thin victory over the Raven Guard, taking the secondaries of For the Emperor, deployed teleport homers and Stranglehold. As you can see, there isn't much of a difference across the score sheet, with Charlie's win probably coming down to the fact he consistently scored 2 victory points on the progressive, corrupted ground. This suggests to me he was trading primaries with his opponent scoring 14 in turn 4 and Charlie 14 in turn 5. I imagine his 5 Demolisher tank commanders would have really bullied the Toughness 4 Space Marines. Charlie won 71-70, and this put the 3 Guard commanders at 6 wins of the accumulative 9 games so far. Go Astra Militarum. Game 4 was the mission Tear Down Their Icons, with a cool endgame objective, Detonation, with you getting 4 victory points for setting explosives in your opponent's deployment zone. I played Emperor's Children, Charlie Drakari and Callum had a bye as his opposing team had a player that couldn't play. I went second again, whilst Charlie went first. Here I took the secondaries of Bring It Down, Engage All Fronts and Retrieve Knuckleman Data. My opponent had a ton of dreadnoughts, including some cool looking retro decimators that shoot mortal wounds. Given Chaos Space Marines are still an 8th edition codex, I felt like this would be a fair matchup. My opponent rushed all his units forward, holding the objectives in no man's land and scored max points on his primaries and 12 on Stranglehold. Turn 1 he destroyed one of my tanks, and we then proceeded to destroy each other's units. By the end of the game, we had an equal amount of model points on the board, and I felt I swung the game back towards me in the later stages of the game, including planting an explosive for 4 victory points. However, his early lead was simply too great, and I lost 68 to 91. Of all the games, I was the most bummed about this loss, given it was up against an 8th edition codex. In Charlie's game against Drukhari, he took the secondaries for the Emperor, Stranglehold and deployed teleport homers. Now when Charlie told me he played Drukhari, I was assuming he would say he got slapped about, but believe it or not, he won. He'd scored 81 to 66, and from what he said, given he got first turn, he was able to take out their raider boats and force their stabby troops to advance up the board on foot. As you can see, he outscored his opponent in almost all areas, scoring 15 on Stranglehold, mind-boggling. So if there's ever to be evidence that Astra Militarum can still compete, here it is. So proud of Charlie and him defeating the top meta army. So at this point, the Guardsman had 7 wins of 11 games played. So the fifth and final game was Recover the Relics. Callum faced off against Grey Knights and Charlie against Necrons. I played another Astra Militarum player with a Cadian list sporting at least 5 tank commanders and 80 plus conscripts. This time round we all went first, and I thought of the irony that the only game I got first turn in was against another guard player. Here I took the secondaries for the Emperor, Psychic Interrogation and deployed teleport homers. As expected, turn 1 I took out one of his manticores and tried to deny his secondaries of retrieve Knuckman data and engage all fronts. I played relatively aggressively, using my 2 Chimeras as suicide vans again, including charging one into a Lehman Russ and cancelling out its firepower for a single turn. Reflecting back, I should have taken Stranglehold, as I could have easily held more. The Bulgrams had a field day flattening poor conscripts, and I felt the variety in my list gave me an advantage in this matchup. The terrain was set up in a way that any tanks had to pop out of the corridors and risk being destroyed. My opponent put up a good fight, destroying 2 of my Lehman Russes, but my victory came down to me scoring a lot more in primaries. I ended up winning 71 to 60, with both of us joking throughout the game that the guard was always going to win. Callum acquitted himself very well against the Grey Knights, maxing a Ball the Witch and Razor Banners high. Me taking an Inquisitor means I obviously can't take a Ball the Witch, and it could have been a natural selection of a secondary to take against 1,000 Suns. I'm still debating whether to drop the Inquisitor for the odd chance of playing against Psycho heavy lists, but for me being able to deal mortal wounds in the Psychic phase has proved critical in a lot of matches. Callum secured himself an 84 to 77 win, and lastly Charlie again did us proud. He thoroughly stomped on his Necron opponent, defeating them at 96 to 59, scoring full marks on his secondaries of deployed teleport homers, behind enemy lines and 12 points on for the Emperor. As you saw earlier, I also defeated the Necrons and have had some good games against them in the past. I feel like they're a manageable matchup, and Charlie took them down 96 to 59. Bloody excellent. So across the 5 rounds, we played 14 games, achieving 10 victories. Of course, I played against Imperial Guard, so Guard was always going to win, but this does illustrate that Astra Militarum can still squeeze out victories. So what can we learn from this? It is completely undeniable that Demolisher Lehman Russes, Manticores and Scions are a must-have. I attribute part of Callum's and Charlie's success to them having a boatload of firepower with enough high damage units to replace those that are naturally destroyed throughout their games. I think to be successful with our 8th edition codex, you need to be playing very meta lists, with Charlie's list rocking 5 Demolisher Lehman Russes. Also, this might sound a bit obvious and a bit silly, but going first means Astra Militarum will always have a much improved chance of winning. Given we all take 2 Manticores, it means you'll be destroying, let's agree, 300 points of your opponent's list before they even begin the game. This evens the odds in the sense that your opponent's 9th edition list at 1700 points is probably a fair matchup given we're still using a flaky 8th edition codex. The more I do say it, the more I believe it, in that Astra Militarum can still be a very competitive army, just needing your opponent's list to be trimmed down a little bit before we begin. So from that, just always roll to go first. That's simple. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed that and found it interesting to hear how I, Callum and Charlie went at that tournament. Callum and Charlie are very good players, and I'm happy how I did, except against the Emperor's Children, where I feel I lost fair and square against an 8th edition codex. Thanks for watching. Paint your platoon, sound off. Tank Commander Watchdog Van Etten, Lieutenant Mitchell, Colour Sergeant DuPont, Sergeants Brady, O'Dell, Gilliam, Merrill, Veteran Gibson, Hall, Lundeen, Witten, Guardsman Combs, Glenn, Hills, Nitton, Nguyen, Smith, Tom, Tompkin, Conscript Craft.